All right, we'll get started. I'm sure a few people will still be coming in the room as we go. I just want to say welcome to all being here today for this Campus Compact workshop on creating space for democracy, methods for promoting civic discourse in higher education. We're pleased to have you here today. We're excited, that this session is happening, and particularly want to thank Nick Longo, who has agreed to come on and work with Campus Compact this year as our Deliberative Dialogue Fellow. So in that role, he's really helping support Campus Compact's efforts to support you as our coalition members to help you build and enhance your programs to build skills in deliberative dialoguing, and particularly with students bridge building across difference. So he's going to be with us. We're publishing with him and Stylus Publishing and AAC&U a new publication called Educating Civic Professionals, a Civics Prompts Guide, which should be out later this year, before the start of the new year, hopefully, as we work on that publishing piece, which really provides folks with some practical tools, or what he calls civic prompts, that can be put to use with students and professional colleagues to develop their competencies as inclusive, civic-minded professionals and publicly engaged future leaders. So we're happy to have him with us. We're happy to have him facilitating this workshop today. I'm going to pass it over to Nick, and he's going to introduce himself and the folks we have here on the panel, and then give a sense of what we're going to be doing together over the next 90 minutes.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Clayton, for the introduction and the work you're doing with Campus Compact. This for me is kind of a full circle moment. I kind of grew up as a student in service learning and community engagement, and it was really transformational for me to think about, I could have a career and I could try to change the world, and I didn't have to decide between those two things. And my first career job was with Campus Compact. As a grad student, I worked in my 20s on a project called Raise Your Voice, which was activating student leaders all around the country. And over time, I've kind of seen the work of colleges and universities as more and more essential to the threats to democracy and to building engaged and educated citizens. And as I've made that connection more and more, I've seen the work of community engagement, service learning as necessarily interconnected with the work of deliberative democracy and civil discourse. And so I'm just delighted to be kind of returning to Campus Compact in this role as a fellow and be supporting folks around the country. And there's no kind of better group of leaders I'm more excited to introduce folks to than the panel we have together today. We're not going to do kind of long introductions to the panelists. I'm going to put their bios in the chat. And I'll say a couple of things about how we're going to think about and organizing today as our agenda. We've got, I think, 5 panelists who are going to just really leaders and different stakeholders, different type of institutions. And we've got a series of questions we're going to ask them to respond to. You're going to hear a lot of different voices. So we think this will be engaging, and we want you to be able to ask questions and be engaged in the chat at any point. So just feel free to add comments, questions. The more robust the chat is, the better the Zoom panel will be. That's been my experience. So I want to encourage you to be doing that. I'll be probably modeling that and doing some comments in the chat. If you like things people say, feel free to add some quotes that they're saying, and just be really engaging and be in conversation. And we're going to do, the panel is probably going to be about 50 minutes or so, 50 minutes to an hour. And then we're going to have a little bit of time for a small group conversation. You're going to be able to meet some other folks, and then we're going to come back and kind of reconvene with the panel and kind of engage with some of the questions that you might have from the small group conversation. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start off with our first question, and we're going to do the panelists in alphabetical order. So Sara Drury, who is the Executive Vice President of Deliberation for Unify America and a professor and director of their Center for Deliberative Democracy at Wabash College. And I'm going to invite Sara to be our first respondent, where kind of each of the panelists are going to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their story. And the specific question that I'd like you all to answer is to think about kind of how you might share your story and your work and how it intersects with civil discourse. And we're using civil discourse as kind of an umbrella term to include dialogue and deliberation. I'm sure we'll get into kind of some of the definitional pieces. but how did you come to see the value of civil discourse, and how is it vital to the work you're doing now? So Sara, thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks to Campus Compact and everybody on the call for coming in today. I'm really excited about this conversation. So for me, I'm trained in communication studies and political science. And so, civil discourse, the history of public discourse in the United States, that's always been a part of my interest and intersecting with higher education. It's also, civil discourse is the heart of what I do. It's about teaching and in practice and working to leverage technology in order to create productive conversations across divides. And the landscape of that has certainly changed in the last 2 decades, but we're still trying, right? I think the heart of this work is still the same. It's about coming to greater understanding of people who you might have differences with, and how do we foster that sharing and that connection. It's critically vital to my work right now. As Nick mentioned, I was the founding director of a program at Wabash College, a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, that focused on dialogue and deliberation on campus and in communities. I've now shifted, I'm on leave right now, and I'm working with Unify America, a nonprofit that's bringing deliberation to communities, to local governments, and trying to scale up productive civil discourse in our society. So that's a little bit about me, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Sara. Next, we have Suchi Gururaj, who's the Assistant VP for Community Engagement and Economic Development at UT Austin.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Campus Compact. I'm very excited about this whole panel today and conversation. I'm inspired to tell you my story. I'm inspired by the students on our panel today. My story actually starts, I do work at the University of Texas, but I also grew up in West Texas during the 80s, and I have an unusual name. It's Suchitra Gururaj. Folks on this call know that I will answer to just about anything. I'll answer to sushi, to suki, to just about anything. But the thread for me is that, that first day of 4th grade, when my teacher went through the roster and stopped cold when they got to the G's, and I raised my hand and I was like, yeah, I think that's me. So that's one of the threads of one of the threads of my story that has led me to this work. The other is that beyond answering to silence, when I did gain my voice, I felt as a young student put in boxes by what other people thought what I was all about, right? So I became a young student activist in high school. I had a black armband around my arm one day and was shouted down by my geometry teacher, who thought, you're a lefty liberal. That's who you are. And then when I went to college and I showed up and I said, y'all, my classmates there said, well, you're a small, quiet Asian woman from the South. You must be very conservative, right? And so another thread of my story is the idea of people putting me in boxes has pushed me to want to resist these boxes and allow people to tell their own story. So what I will say is that, this idea of invisibility has enabled me to work in spaces that really elevate people's voices. For instance, on the Austin Asian Complete Count Committee during the 2020 census, really elevating the voices of the burgeoning Asian population in Austin, Texas. And my interest in making sure that we're not defining each other and putting other people in boxes has allowed me to work at storytelling in my own work. And that comes to bear in all the programs of our Center for Community Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin, including our front porch gatherings, which seek to convene folks from everywhere, stakeholders from everywhere around wicked issues in Austin, but bringing their own lived experience to the table to bear on figuring out what those collaborative solutions are going to be. So I've had a circuitous journey, but thinking about our students on this panel, sometimes this has an early spark, as it did for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. And as Suchi mentioned, we're very delighted to have students on this panel. And one of our leaders is Jake Katz, who's a sophomore at Stanford University, and he's pursuing a BA in communications.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, so my name is Jake, and I've long since been involved in discourse, but my first introduction to real structured civil discourse was with Professor Tom Schnabel when I took his course, which was a deliberative democracy practicum, where we were a lot more focused on making sure that we could generate conversations that were informed and also promoting respectful dialogue in between different parties. In high school, my friends and I would always talk about politics, and there were a lot of very different opinions, but I don't know if I would go so far as to say it was always civil discourse. It was sometimes like more brash. So finding ways that you can encourage people to meet each other where they are and not hold judgment or prejudice for what their opinions are, and understand that it's a result of their lived experience, is really valuable to me. And I would say that also now with my degree, more of what I'm looking at is some political communication stuff, such as disinformation and misinformation, and a lot of social media discourse that's happening. I'm currently working in the social media lab with another professor at Stanford and looking at how political discourse can shape people's perspectives. So for example, seeing how influencers have changed people's perspectives on things like the Stop AAPI hate movement, or other veins of like political discourse and things like that. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jake. And our other student, who's actually one of my teachers, a student at Providence College, who's involved with our Dialogue, Inclusion, and Democracy Lab, and is a finance major, a senior at PC, Valeria Murillo.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Valeria Murillo. I'm a senior at Providence College. I had this whole answer prepared, but now that I just heard Suchi's story, it really I relate to it a lot, because I'm an immigrant. I'm from Venezuela and I moved to the States 6 years ago. I moved to Miami, and ever since I put a foot in Miami, people were trying to put me in boxes because of my ethnicity, my nationality, the fact that I didn't speak English, just boxes and boxes and boxes. And then I got into college in a prominently white institution, that is Providence College, in the small state in New England. And then more boxes, oh, because I'm Latin. And then, oh, you care about this. And I'm a finance major. And it's oh, you're a finance major. But then if you see my resume, most of my stuff has nothing to do with business. So it's people always try to assume stuff about me. And I find that civil discourse has given me a way to kind of learn from people and also teach people things, if that makes sense. And something else that I guess is what I see the value of civil discourse is that it allows you to engage in conversation with an open mind, because a lot of the times people go into conversations just thinking they're right, but they don't let themselves learn. But if you already know that you're going to be in a conversation that you actually want to learn from other people and share your opinion, then it's way more fruitful. So I've learned everything I know about the United States through civil discourse, and it's been a great experience. And also my first, I guess, formal civil discourse discussion was when I took the colloquium with Dr. Nick Longo and Dr. Quincy Beverly in sophomore year. And a colloquium is called Deep Colloquium, so it's Dialogue, Inclusion, and Democracy. And it was about civil discourse, different types of dialogues, wicked problems, and just how to be able to talk about it. So it was very eye-opening, and it was an opportunity to talk with my peers about my experience as an immigrant and learn from their experiences, from different backgrounds.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then our final panelist is another alumni of Campus Compact from another life, Tom Schnabelt, who is a senior advisor on civic education for Stanford University's Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me. Really humbled to be part of the panel and to see these great names. Just a quick shout out to my colleagues from the University of Wisconsin Parkside, Faye Kindays and Deborah Karp, who I worked with when I was there. And I just want to say, connecting to what you were saying, Suchi, about the names, I also have a difficult name, but I grew up in a place where the name wasn't difficult. But when I moved to the South, it became difficult for a lot of people because of the diphthongs. So that was interesting. And Valerie, I love the concept of boxes comes up a lot when folks have been talking, and I'm just thinking about Pete Seeger's song, Little Boxes. And if you haven't heard that song, folks should go have a listen. My journey in this has been through very similar to Nick's, like through the service learning and civic and community engagement field. I've always thought of the work that we do as a really particular form of experiential learning where students are going to be exposed to difference. And that the experiences that we have them engaged in are part of a text. And we have an ethical obligation about intentionality and reciprocity that's around doing no harm to community and not reinforcing negative stereotypes or boxes, to be quite frank. And for me, the sort of work towards deliberative democracy and civil discourse began with a sense that I began to feel in myself a sense of orthodoxy and maybe some blind spots for me. And I grew up in Wisconsin, in a really rural part of Wisconsin. And about 6 years ago, I began an informal project at Stanford about what we can do to deepen engagement with rural communities, because I think that urban-rural political division is one of the most salient in our country. And as part of that effort, we brought rural students together, and what we noticed were some pretty interesting things. First, contrary to what a lot of people assumed, the group was actually far more ethnically diverse than Stanford's already incredibly diverse student body. And in fact, students that were rural students were actually twice as likely to be first-generation low income than the general student body. But we also noticed a number of really interesting things that spurred my interest in civil discourse and democratic dialogue. First of all, the low number of rural students at Stanford, and I should mention it's only about 4 to 5% of the Stanford undergraduate student body is from rural locations. 19% of the Americans are from those same areas. But the low numbers of rural, the fact that we had so few rural students didn't solely fall to the admissions group at Stanford. It was actually a lot of cultural variables. Almost every student we talked to from a rural area reported that there was pressure for them not to accept the admissions to Stanford, to go to California, to go to the liberal institution, yada, yada, yada. There also was a huge experience and exposure gap. Students that hailed from urban areas were not being exposed or confronting rural communities. Of the 582 summer service internships we had in 2018, only 19 of those students went to rural areas, and only one of the students of that 19 actually was from an urban area. So the others were basically rural students going to rural places. I will also say the reaction from some of my colleagues about the effort was mixed. Some were very supportive, others, a small number, raised concerns about the need to support rural and, to them, white America. And then the last thing I'll say is that the rural students also expressed an incredible lack of sense of belonging that were very similar to the sentiments that we were hearing from BIPOC students. And as you can imagine, when Trump got elected, this went from bad to worse for those students in particular. And I suspect that Trump's election elicited the same reaction that it did here at Stanford on your campus. And frankly, I was actually personally horrified, but I couldn't slip into that comfortable outrage because my family, my immediate family, was basically jubilant. They were very happy about this. And so I was faced with the forced decision of either alienating the people I love or being alienated by them. And that tension has really troubled me. And I suspect a lot of you on the webinar are struggling with the similar challenge. I continue to struggle with that. I've led a career that's been focused on exposing students to difference, and I was really, quite frankly, surprised at how difficult it's been to effectively engage across that conflict. The last thing I'll say about this journey of mine is that I've also just been, and it sounds like Nick as well, just increasingly concerned that while community engagement and service learning has a lot of potential when done ethically and effectively, for good outcomes. We've paid far too little attention about training for political systems, democratic governance, and explaining democratic value, why democratic values matter. And the fact that 30% of millennials don't think it does matter is really concerning to me. So I just think it's really critical that we acknowledge the American experiment in democracy hasn't worked for everybody. I think the outcomes that we in the community and civic engagement field aspire to also can't be accomplished without attending to strengthening our experiment in democracy. And I actually really like the way that Amanda Gorman puts it. She said, our democracy hasn't failed, it's simply unfinished.
Thanks, Tom. That's beautiful. I was just about to quote you, and keeping track of the chat and or writing in the chat and moderating is going to be my challenge, but I'm going to try to do it. Thank you so much. So these are our panel. We've got folks' bios in the chat, so go check those out, get folks' contact information. I also want to encourage you all to write in the chat. Like if you hear something someone's saying that's exciting, comment on it, get a conversation going in the chat, ask questions in the chat. We've got a couple of big topics that we want to start with, and then we're going to kind of shift to more campus examples. And the kind of big topic, and then I think Tom has just got to start on this, some of the challenges we're facing for democracy. And we want to go deeper into like why civil discourse is seen as a leverage point. Why is this an opportunity to really engage with some of the kind of problems in and of democracy that we're seeing? And so we're going to invite Sara now to talk about some of the work that you're doing with Unify America, where you're working all across the U.S. and trying to use civil discourse and deliberative dialogue to bring folks together. So Sara, can you talk a little bit about kind of why you see civil discourse as the solution, but also what are some of the challenges? Where are some of the places that you're getting pushback on that?
Yeah. So I think I'll start by drawing our attention to what just happened as we shared our stories as a way of introduction, right? The opportunity to hear something that resonates or that causes a question to form, or that, right, causes you to say, oh, I had some things prepared, but now I want to engage with you. That same dynamic, and I'm sure it's something many of you recognize from the best class discussions, right? That is what is civil discourse is all about, right? I think that's the opportunity of civil discourse. Understandably, in today's political climate, that's the challenge, right? The climate is the challenge. People are nervous about sharing themselves, about sharing their stories. Addressing some of our biggest political problems, addressing some of the divides, whether it's rural, urban, and I've noticed the chat saying rural, urban, suburban, right? The things that, right, we might think are divisive, but actually can be an opportunity to learn from one another. That's really the power of civil discourse, of dialogue, of sitting down together and listening for understanding, right? Or even, right, deliberation, where we're moving from that understanding into trying to solve problems. I'll share a little bit about my time at Wabash College, and then I'll put in a note about what Unify America is doing. So I'll just say that during my time at Wabash, what I've seen is that while students might be nervous about conversations on political issues, they want to see something better than the current state of public discourse. And so whether we're talking about, mental health or DEIJ, right, it is remarkable about how putting people in a room, whether it's a Zoom room like this or whether it's a room on campus, changes the dynamic and allows that exchange and mutual learning to occur. So I think there's real opportunities for that, even if it feels like, oh, wow, that feels quite different than what we see in our political discourse. And it is different, but that's actually the opportunity. And I also want to note, this is an opportunity that I imagine is resonant with many of you. Gen Z wants something more from our public discourse, from our politics. They are a more civically engaged generation than we've seen in years. And that is an opportunity, right? I think for us as educators, as people who want to promote this kind of more productive discourse. So the Unify America is creating some experiences to promote civil discourse using technology. And if you're looking for an entry-level engagement activities for students, the Unify Challenge promotes connections across divides, whether those divides are demographic, so age or gender or race, political ideologies, or even geographic, right? Uniting people from the coasts. And so the Unify Challenge is a 2-person conversation with guided dialogue prompts about political problems. So it's 2 people on a screen, and they each receive a question and talk about it. What's maybe different is that at Unify America, we start with shared goals. And we ask people to talk about what it is that we want for our future rather than what divides us right now. And so that's kind of the goal of the Unify Challenge, is to get people focusing on what should be rather than getting immediately into the tactics that might divide us. So our focus here is, and Nick, do you have the slides? Or do you want me to share those? Okay, so our focus is to address challenges of polarization and uncivil discourse. We really want to have an opportunity to talk about a range of issues. You can see on this slide that we have upcoming dates in the spring 2023 semester, February 23rd to March 2nd, and you can find out more information. There's a link in the chat for that as well. What we have learned, and this is the next slide, Nick, if you don't mind, what Unify America is seeing from the roughly 1,500 college students who participated this semester and more from previous semesters, that college students really appreciate and enjoy this experience, and they see it's important. They feel more hopeful about the future of our country after they come together and talk. That is the opportunity of civil discourse, that we can, right, help students to feel hopeful about their future and to find ways to be more civically engaged and act. And so it also helps them to understand, right, people who might vote differently than them, and that people might have good reasons for different beliefs. And so it's a really positive, I think, mode of civic engagement and creating connections. So I'm happy to take questions in the chat, or you can email me. My email is in my bio that Nick distributed. But yeah, I think this really sums up for me the opportunity we have to create connections across divides. And that's one of the experiences that Unify America is working to promote to address that opportunity.
Thanks, Sarah. So we got introduced to we're also getting into some really practical tools that folks could use on campuses with Unify America and the College Bowl Challenge. Next, I want to invite Tom to kind of add to that. Sarah had mentioned Gen Z as kind of a politically active group and kind of unique in some ways around some of their experiences that they've gone through with COVID and kind of some of the really underlying challenges to democratic life that I think previous generations might not have seen in such a direct way. So Tom, could you talk a little bit about how you're addressing this both at Stanford, and I know you're also starting to think about kind of partnering with other campuses. So kind of where do you see kind of big picture our college students at around deliberative democracy? What are some of the challenges, and how are you really thinking about how kind of opportunities for intervention?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And thanks, Sarah. That's a great tool. I do want to say, I think a lot of the challenge around this work is actually creating the structured opportunities. I mean, we're in community and civic engagement. We've talked for a long time about needing to be intentional about reflection and that the structure of the opportunities is really important. And I think that's really important here, because this idea of engaging constructively across or in conversations where you're talking about moral, value-oriented things, it does take the structures of like the College Bowl with Unify. And you know, I just want to plug and shout out to your book, Nick. That book it's just chock full of a lot of different resources. The Heterodox Academy also just released a guide about advancing open inquiry and catalogs ideas for institutional affairs, student affairs professionals, and even academic affairs. So really grateful for the lots of different tools that are out there that are being used. I also just want to point out, I think there's sort of a tension between a group of people that thinks of this as like an academic freedom problem, and those that and that is a real problem. the idea that so many states right now have educational gag orders that are either already passed or are being considered. Those are really important challenges. But I will say that I think equally as important, if not a more pressing challenge, is this idea of self-censorship. It's more informal, and people avoiding questioning or challenging stated or implied norms out of fear of just being criticized or being ostracized. There was a recent survey that said 60% of a national college sample expresses reluctance to discuss controversial topics. And so I do want to say that I think in some ways these structures, whether it's the College Bowl or the thing that I'll share with you that I'll invite you to, the structures are really important. They're like gyms for working out this muscle of constructively engaging across differences. So I do want to talk about an important structure that we've created and that we're working both here at Stanford, but also inviting you and your students to participate in, and that's deliberative polling. And just a quick kind of primer on what deliberative polling is. Jake may share a little bit more too, but essentially participants are pre-polled. They do a pre and post poll on a variety of policy proposals in a thematic area. All the participants get balanced briefing materials in advance to sort of say, hey, here's some different pros and cons to different policy proposals. All of the participants participate in small group deliberations and develop questions for a panel of experts. And that plenary session is then speakers with very different perspectives. And then the practicum participants actually develop a report. The students that are involved in our practicum, I should have mentioned that. The deliberative polling event is actually developed by students and for students, and they also develop a report that analyzes and reports on the results of the poll and what movements and changes happen. So just as an example of one that we're going to be talking about later this fall, is around campus discourse and polarization. And it's going to include discussions, like one example of a policy proposal might be that was thrown out by a student, said, all campuses should adopt the University of Chicago principles to be eligible for federal funding. Okay, well, let's talk about that. And so there'll be a conversation about that, and maybe that, I'm not sure that one's going to make it in, but it gives you a sense. Now, I want to say the Deliberative Democracy Lab worked with the CS department at Stanford and developed an online platform that uses artificial intelligence to moderate the small group conversations, and therefore it's infinitely scalable. And so that brings me to the opportunity I want to share with you. There's the students in this year's Deliberative Democracy Practicum are going to be hosting 2 deliberative polling events this fall. One is on November 5th, and Nick, if you want to share the slide, I'm going to actually put a link in the chat to a document that if you want to sign up to help us recruit from your campus, you can. But we're basically on November 5th and 6th, we're going to be hosting 2 deliberative polling events. One is going to be on elections and voting proposals to decrease polarization, and the other is campus discourse proposals to decrease polarization. So as I said, we're going to be using, we're actually going to get a representative sample of college students from across the country for the experimental part of this, but we want to invite students from campuses across the country to participate in both or either of these polling events. So if you'd be willing to forward information about these events to your students on your campus, sign up. You can also email me if you've got questions. Happy to answer more questions after the webinar with folks. One other thing is that I mentioned that students actually do this. There's students from across the country. You can see some of the campuses listed on the slide that are a part of the practicum. We will be expanding to other campuses in the next fall. So if you've got students you think might want to participate in a national practicum with us to organize these polls, happy to chat about that too. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, and thank you for more resources and ways that campuses can be engaged and be involved in deliberative polling. We want to next get a sense of like what this feels like on the ground. And Jake was in Tom's class and is also kind of going to talk. Well, I'm wondering, Jake, if you could talk a little bit about the experience of being involved with that class, and what do you see like specifically in your kind of speaking as a student? Like what would you like to see colleges and universities do? How can faculty, administrative staff, create those kinds of structures that Tom is talking about that would be supportive for students who want to be engaged in this kind of work?
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing is the format of the class, instead of being lecture-based, was a practicum. So the goal was actually to create and refine a product and put it into use. And that product in this case was the deliberative polling events that we did. One was on campus and one was the national sample. So I think it was really helpful because we were given, I guess, the autonomy and the position where we were the leaders and not just being told like statistics or things like that. We got the background and then we're encouraged to go develop our own model. And after we asked participants what they thought of the deliberations, and 81% said that the event was valuable with a specific focus on small group discussions. So the format is sort of, you get briefing material, you're pre-polled, you get briefing materials and hear from experts. There are small group discussions, and then there's a plenary session with experts who can answer questions live. So the most helpful, it seemed, was the small group discussions where you were just discussing with your peers how you felt about the issue. And 78% of participants felt that was valuable. 69% felt the briefing materials helped them to clarify their positions on the issues. And 60% thought that the plenary sessions with experts helped them to better understand their positions on the issues as well. So I think that it's really valuable to, I guess, humanize the other person and to have more of a conversation than a debate. So also, I guess, as someone who's a part of Gen Z, with regards to why there might be more political activity or an inclination to be a part of that, I think a lot of it is growing up surrounded by social media and things like Omegle, where it's sort of a more unmoderated version of what Sara was talking about with College Bowl. It's less directive, and it's more you get matched with a random person somewhere in the world and you can talk about whatever you want. And there are a lot of really positive things that come out of that and a lot of really negative things that come out of that in terms of just really harsh discourse that can happen. So I think that the models that we've seen have been a lot of engaging in conversation, but not always in ways that are explicitly productive. So I think moving towards more structured, regulated, and moderated platforms is a really valuable transition that's taking place. But I think also the cross perspective kind of shifts, where instead of seeing a bunch of broad perspectives and maybe aligning yourself with a couple, but also listening to people who you disagree with, in schools, sometimes the structure doesn't lend itself to that, and it lends itself more to, I guess I would say, echo chambers in terms of like young Democrats or young Republicans or clubs like that, where you meet with people. If you want to be politically engaged, you meet with other people who want to be politically engaged in the same community or the same vein, or you meet to help promote a specific issue. So I think that it has become a lot more segmented and kind of like isolated when you get into school structures. So I think it would be really helpful for schools to provide a space for not just young Democrats or young Republicans, but young voters or young activists or people who are just generally interested in talking about politics without being a specific, like, I guess, being boxed in, going back to what Suchi and Valeria were saying, avoiding those boxes and just allowing people to talk about what they're passionate about. I think it's also really important to have physical space, like a specific room that's dedicated to this, or like that you can, I guess, create an environment that is not like inflammatory, but instead is conducive to allowing students to just enter, feel comfortable, and be able to talk about what's on their mind. On top of that, I think not just consistent space, but consistent times. Consistent meetings will build community and allow for people to understand more of the human side of things and understand other people's lived experiences in and outside of the political landscape, which helps to understand why they hold certain perspectives. And I think one of the major things that's on the rise is affective polarization, which is disdain for people who are just in the other political party, regardless of issues, just oh, you're in this party, like I want to disaffiliate with you. And I think Pew has done some good polling on that with regards to how people would feel if their kid were to marry someone of the opposite political party, things along that line. So you can really see that on the rise. And I think, once again, like humanizing people and having moderation that's dedicated to conversation instead of debate is really important. And one thing that I recognize is sort of a luxury that I've been afforded at Stanford is space from school. And just to focus on democracy, last year we had our first ever democracy day, which every election day, regardless of whether or not there's election, we don't have school in order to allow people to sort of come together and talk about democracy and the state of our country or world. What that looks like at your school might be different, because I recognize that there are a lot of challenges with administrators getting space from the kind of myopic focus on just learning without a break to sort of discuss what you've learned. So that's something that I would say is something to work towards, and hopefully becomes more normalized as time goes on, but is really valuable, and I think allowed for a lot of students on campus to participate in our deliberative democracy practicum, because they didn't have class conflicts and they weren't being assigned work by their professors or lecturers. So it was really nice to be able to have that. And yeah, I would say that at the end of the day, pinpointing student leaders is really valuable, because there are a lot of voices from adults and administrators right now, or parents, or whoever it is, giving you advice and telling you, oh, this is what you should do while you're in college. This is really valuable. And I think oftentimes they're right, but it's hard to actually want to listen, because I think it's kind of a delayed stage of teenagerhood where you're still kind of wanting to rebel and not listen to what anyone has to say. But if you can find a student who's really passionate about this and is willing to work with you to promote this, hearing from a peer is really valuable. And yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. With some really also the practical ideas, like a democracy day, having physical space, like set meeting times, along with kind of the big picture work that you're doing at Stanford. So thank you, Jake, for that. There was one question, if you could respond to that in the chat, a specific, oh, we got the link for it. So thank you to Laura. We also had one question in the chat, and I think we'll make sure we get to this. So I want to give Marlene a shout out for adding a question in the chat. And our next section, we're going to really talking about campus experiences. So we'll try to build this in, but Marlene does ask the question. So I want to kind of bracket this and kind of make sure we address this at some point. Any examples of working in frontier communities with local leaders, fostering civil discourse, and also shared goals? Yes, but tips to develop current entrenched leaders to build civil discourse skills. And that's something that's really close to my heart, around thinking about kind of how we develop civic professionals or citizen professionals. So kind of thinking about entrenched leaders and also kind of those frontier communities. So we'll make sure we get to those. Our next campus example, though, we want to kind of use to kind of start this conversation is some of the work that Valeria is doing at Providence College in the School of Business, which is kind of like an unlikely place to think about where can we be embedding kind of dialogue and deliberation work. So Valeria, could you talk a little bit about how you're doing this work in the School of Business, how you got started on that, and also some of the challenges for doing it?
Okay, perfect. So the main thing I'm doing in the School of Business is that we have a dialogue, inclusion, and democracy wall. So basically it's a wall, we pose a question and we let people write answers anonymously. Students, faculty, staff, anyone who comes to the School of Business can just write it. They don't have to be a business student or anything like that. And I got involved in this because, again, back to the colloquium on sophomore year, I did something similar in another building. And then junior year, I joined Student Congress and in the DEI committee. And my project, I was like, oh, this is perfect because I'm a business major. And then I can combine it with the lead wall. And we launched one with the help of our professors and the staff in the business schools. In the business school last year, at the end of fall semester, and I have a small cohort of business students that we meet kind of bi-weekly to come up with questions and just talk about what's been happening and if we want to do an event and if we want to reach out to professors. most of the questions are meant to raise awareness on social issues that are happening, or if we just want feedback from students on a specific topic. Like last question was about, it was Mental Illness Week in October, and it was like, how can you check in with students? Because we had some recent very sad news on campus regarding mental health. So we were like, okay, we want to make sure that we are like talking about it. In the business school, it's pretty interesting to see the answers we get sometimes compared to other. There is a building in Providence College that's called Moore Hall. Most of the BIPOC community like hangs out in that building, if that makes sense. So a lot, like we tried the other day that we put the same question in the walls, and it's like different, the answers I got in the business school versus the answers they got there. And it's definitely like interesting to see how like business students also care, because there is like this stigma, this like stereotype that like we only care about money, which is, it is true to some degree, because we are studying money and economy and how to make more money. But at the same time, there are other ethical important parts when you study business, and this kind of brings a light to that. And it also, in business classes, we don't really cover anything that has to do with diversity most of the time, or anything about civic discourse. Like we don't care what your political party is, we just care if you can make money or not, type of thing. Very direct. But then this gives you student a space to actually engage in dialogue and share their opinions, or share something that's like, we've had really good answers that we like bring them up to the DEI committee of the faculty and staff of the business schools with the dean of the business school. If we have like an answer that is like, oh, like we should do something about this or something like that. So it's been fruitful. And then in the future, we're just trying to make more walls with the DIT lab. There is a research lab led by Nick and Professor Quincy. And we also want to start doing more in-person events so that we can bring those questions to in-person settings to actually get people to talk about it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I put a link to so you could kind of see what the democracy wall in the business school looks like. It's a really high tech, and Valerie has been doing amazing organizing to make that happen. We want to also like another campus example. And so Tom was gracious enough to mention a book that I co-edited with Tim Schafer called Creating Space for Democracy, which in some ways was the inspiration for this panel today. And one of the amazing authors we had in that book was Suchi, who wrote about the front porch conversations. And Sara is also in that book, a couple of different chapters. But Suchi, in that chapter, you write about this idea of self-interest, which is really, you know, in my organizing life, I sometimes see that that language. But can you talk about kind of that idea of self-interest and how you see that kind of idea situated in the work that you're doing between campus and community, and why can maybe it be difficult to do this kind of work in Austin, in Texas right now, and some of the history of UT Austin with the community?
Yeah, absolutely. I will absolutely answer this question, but I am enjoying listening to all the other panelists. Sara, thank you for talking about just the divisiveness that exists in general and setting that scene. And I think this answer for me is really around what Valeria said about business students. You can make change from wherever you are. And I think that's what I see as the goal of a public institution or a land grant institution. You know, we have a very specific mission. There is a cornerstone near the UT Tower that says the core purpose of this university is to transform lives for the benefit of society. So it's literally written in stone what our plan is. We are supposed to be contributing to the state's economy. We are supposed to be contributing to the promotion of arts. We are supposed to be contributing to workforce. You know, we are part of the economic engine of this state. And that's where the idea of self-interest really arises from, is this idea that we've talked about this before, this idea that, you know, there are wonderful missions of these universities, particularly publics and land grants, around truth and light and all of those things. But the truth is we can't do any of those things unless we survive. And so our survival really depends on this dialectic between the university and our communities. So, just by way of that conversation, and maybe this kind of gets to Marlene's question, we created a program, for instance, in 2014, when the city of Austin went from at-large representation in the city council. So we were represented by wealthy, central Austin, mostly white, city council folks for a very diversifying city. In 2014, we went to district representation with 10 very diverse districts, ethnically, politically, all the things. And so our center, I lead the Center for Community Engagement in the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement at UT Austin. Our center developed the Austin City Hall Fellows Program. And the idea was to work with City Hall to really identify those up and coming leaders around these districts that City Hall didn't know anything about, as well as to sort of strengthen that pipeline of potential public servants from our public university into something related to catalyzing change, not necessarily politics. Part of this is really important because, just upon my sort of casual glance of the Texas House of Representatives, about a fifth of our reps are not only Texas public higher education graduates, but also UT Austin graduates. So if we're not doing this right where we are, we're not doing it right for the state. So you're talking about challenges. I live in Texas. I'm all about challenges. I'm going to take a deep breath. The first is obviously the divisiveness that people are seeing across the nation, definitely happening here. And Tom, I really appreciate the idea of self-centering. I heard Jake sort of talk about this idea too, about, people just want to get through, our students just want to get through. And I think there's definitely a sensibility that divisiveness is something that maybe the institution is casually supporting as well. But for where we are, the attacks on academic freedom are very real here. And so our job, I am both a faculty member, I'm an administrator. As an administrator, my job is really to protect those faculty spaces, those classroom spaces where all of you all teach. And part of that is providing faculty fellows, young faculty, sort of information that they need, including sort of an anti-racist history of Austin. Like, this is 1928, the city was segregated. This is how you create an inclusive classroom in your spaces. That's one threat and a solution. I think the other threat is for publics and land grants. There has been a long history of distrust that we have created with our surrounding communities, based on land grants, land grabs, eminent domain use, other things like that. And so when we talk about the front porch gatherings, we talk about, Jake, you said it, a space we call ourselves the front porch of the university because the university is a behemoth. It's scary. Nobody wants to come here. You can't park here. So the front porch gatherings are often on spaces off campus. They're in churches. They're in community centers. They're in third spaces that people trust, right? And so the idea behind those front porch gatherings is to convene people based on their lived experiences. We leave our titles at the door kind of situation, to work on these problems. And, the front porches are a part of this division of diversity and community engagement that we created in 2007 after, and this is the third challenge, the final challenge, is the challenge of creating a diverse pipeline into public education and therefore out of public education. In 2007, based on the Hopwood case in Texas that disallowed us from using race in admissions, we created the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement. And really our role is to think about how do we elevate diversity in all its forms on our campus. And so in part, we do that through outreach, we do that through storytelling. We do that through supporting first-generation college students, all sorts of diverse college students, when they're not necessarily in their major or in their college, but as part of a larger community. So, you know, I think that challenge of diversity, we know from the Michigan cases that diversity is the answer to a robust democracy and to robust workspaces. And so how do we deliberately create spaces and opportunities to encourage that diversity on our campuses? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Suchi. So I wanted to get two other voices in here to just talk, because this is kind of going to set up the work that we're going to ask you to do in small groups. We know some of you might have to leave it too, but we want you, as many as you as can, to stay with us and be part of this conversation. We're going to go till 2:30. But as a way to get us ready for this, we wanted to introduce these campus examples, kind of how we might work with different constituencies. Suchi just introduced work with the community. Sara, could you talk kind of briefly, but it's really innovative example of how you work with faculty at Wabash, and kind of what's an example of how you might integrate this work with faculty life? And I know you've done a lot of work with STEM faculty, but really across the different academic disciplines.
Sure. So I think I'll say that I've worked with faculty in STEM. I've done a couple of workshops for the Council of Independent Colleges on first-year experience faculty. So how do we, in their first semester, right, help students to have these difficult conversations across identity and diversity, and to learn from one another. I think one of the biggest things that I take away from that experience is how much faculty are eager for this if there's a plan. And so in my capacity as the center director at Wabash, a lot of my role was talking to faculty about what they wanted students to get out of the experience, and then thinking how we would design a dialogue or deliberation in order to help achieve those learning outcomes. And so with STEM faculty, one of the biggest concerns was, I want my students to think of themselves as, right, scientists and citizens. Well, how do we get to that place, right? And there's a number of resources, whether it's the Living Room Conversations or the National Issues Forum, that have guides around science and kind of socio-scientific issues, right? Ways that you could go into that, and then supplement, right, with some of the curricular demands of that particular specialty. So that work, I find with STEM faculty especially, there's a real interest in helping students to think about the civic aspects of science and finding a way in there. So I'll briefly note, and if you're interested in working with STEM faculty, please send me an email. I'm happy to follow up. I've been fortunate to work with some faculty on some National Science Foundation grants. And one of the biggest things our research shows is that students learn scientific learning outcomes alongside civic outcomes. In other words, when they are engaged in discussion or deliberation about a socio-scientific issue, say environmental contaminants, they learn the chemistry content alongside the civic learning outcomes. And that is something that we've been able to test now, thanks to the National Science Foundation. We've been able to test that across several campuses and see some differences. So that's always helpful. Another thing I'll say, I always look for opportunities to engage the public. And so working with a range of faculty, but again, with STEM faculty, think about who's already coming to your campus to give a guest lecture. Take a look at their CV, take a look at what they've done. Are they someone who could give a very deep academic talk on campus, and then show as an example of giving a public talk, just like we were just talking about with the French porch. Where can we hold these talks? Maybe not on our campus, but perhaps, say in our case, in a local community museum, where we have an evening event with the same person who gave a lunchtime talk in biology. Well, now they're giving a public talk, and the only requirement we gave for that public talk at the museum was we wanted it to end with a question. so that people could break into small groups and talk about that question for 15 to 20 minutes. And we worked with a scientist who more than rose, right? Several different people who more than rose to that option and had really robust conversations with students, faculty and staff, community members in this third space setting in order to produce greater civil dialogue. So the big things I would say are finding out what faculty are interested in and addressing those opportunities and their concerns, and then looking for chances to engage the community with the resources you already have on your campus. If you have a lecture series, are there ways you can add to it or place it more in a public engagement perspective? I think those are some of the key ideas that I've used in my capacity as a center director to connect with faculty around civil discourse.
Thanks, Sara. Some really helpful, practical examples of working with faculty, but also engaging the public and kind of making this work and making universities more publicly engaged. Kind of as a final thing before we get into our groups, I wonder, Jake, if you were so helpful before about kind of giving some really practical ideas like physical space, Democracy Day, what other kind of ideas do you have? How can folks engage students in this work? How do we get kind of embed this in student life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that one of the major things, like I said, is involving student leaders. I think that there's a lot of work that's been done to pinpoint student leaders in terms of undergraduate senate and things like that, where there are people who are elected by their peers. And I think that that's really valuable, but also getting people who are outside of that apparatus is really valuable, because I think it kind of follows pretty logically that people who are involved in student government are involved in national or local government, but seeing voices of people who maybe aren't as noticeably or traditionally involved in government is also a really important way of sort of demonstrating that there is no barrier to entry and anyone can take part. So I think also involving community partners, so elevating diverse voices, reaching out to institutions like different student unions or student groups, involving other clubs and organizations that are already existing on campus, and leveraging existing groups as a way to complement discussions that happen around democracy and government and things like that, because obviously it's something that all of us are affected by. So hopefully something that also these different groups will be passionate about amplifying and sort of helping you to do the work that you're doing. So yeah, I think just leveraging existing groups is really valuable, and you don't always have to sort of reinvent the wheel. You can take advantage of what's already there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. And so we know that some people have to go at 2. And so, but we also wanted, some people come to these things for different reasons. You just want to listen in, get some ideas, but we also wanted to give you a chance to meet some other folks, right? So, be in conversation with other colleagues across different places. Sometimes you can feel isolated on your campus. So we're going to do a quick 10 minutes where we're going to get you into one of 3 different groups. So you can kind of pick which one of these groups, which area you're really interested in kind of diving deeper into. And one breakout group is going to be specifically around this question around how we embed civil discourse into student life, right? So kind of what Jake was just talking about, and kind of how we can build this into student affairs, into, student experience on campus. So folks who want to think about that, and we're asking you to think about kind of 3 different questions. Why is this important? Why do you want to think about this in student life? What are some of the obstacles to doing it? And what has worked? So really to capture some of the stories from some of your colleagues. A second is going to be notes on embedding this civil discourse in the curriculum. So how do we kind of embed this in academics and in curricular life on campus? Why is that important? What are the obstacles and what has worked? And then a third is kind of notes, and on your Jamboard, you can take notes on this, embedding it in the community. Why is that important? What are the obstacles and what has worked? On the Jamboard, you'll see there's 4 different tabs, and the first tab is just questions and comments for the panel. So you can kind of add any questions that you might have. When we come back, we can address these questions. We want you to you could add that on a post-it on your Jamboard first. And then the second one is around embedding in student life. So if you're in the breakout group around student life, you would go to that one, to that, the second tab. Third tab is around the curriculum. And then the fourth tab is around working in the community. Any questions on, it's going to be a quick breakout. So this is going to be 10 minutes, but you'll get a chance to meet some other folks. Any questions on kind of this process? Everyone's able to access the Jamboard. And then Clayton, do you have the groups that you can share?
I do. We have 3 groups. When I open the rooms, you should be able to self-select into any of those 3 that you wish. Are we ready to do that? I'm happy to open them up.
I think we're ready. Yeah, let's do it.
10 minutes and we'll be back.
I think that's a good idea. Welcome back, everyone. I'm removing the spotlight because we want this final 10 minutes to just be more open-ended conversation. Let's see, do we have everyone off spotlight? Am I off? So thank you all it just means so much to us for you all to kind of spend some time together in small groups, to be able to connect, to build some social capital across campuses. We want to just do that for these final 10 minutes, kind of across our slightly larger group. We had the Jamboard, and we know the student life group gets extra credit because they actually put some things on the Jamboard. So we have a little bit of sense of some of the questions that you all were wrestling with or talking about. Maybe are there any questions that folks kind of want to pose to the panel, kind of open up any comments? And then if not, we'll kind of build on some of the things that were in that Jamboard. But based on our panelists, your small group conversation, what's kind of that burning question, burning issue that you'd like to kind of spend a little bit of time on? Yeah, Sophia.
It was kind of funny in our student life group. All 4 of us ended up being from community colleges. So we were talking about the conversation about it'd be great if we had a dialogue wall as beautiful as the one that was shared. It'd be great if we had a physical space on campus and more staff and money to do these things, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So from there, talking about what can we use, how can we utilize, we didn't get into the conversation as much, but it was helpful to know that those problems exist on other campuses too. And then we talked a lot about how faculty and staff can be helpful or not helpful in these conversations. And we didn't get into it as much as if we had a little bit more time, I think we would get a little bit more, but I just really appreciated the conversation about community colleges and what we can do because we are small but mighty.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So, and Sophia, which community college are you in or part of?
Susan and I, who's also in the call, we are at Columbus State Community College in Columbus, Ohio.
Awesome. Do how other folks want to kind of get at this? Because I think we're all feel, first of all, community college is where most of our college students are. So it's small, it's like you're actually large and mighty. But I think that the real challenge is this kind of lack of resources. Do anybody else want to kind of talk about that, like how you do this with not a lot of resources? Because that's we're all have a different version of that challenge, but I think it's especially pronounced on community colleges.
Nick, I just wanted to ask Sophia and Susan, was it about, you're in Columbus. Do you find yourself being able to partner with OSU or any of the satellite campuses of OSU? And do they reach out to you guys?
I'm a little bit newer. Susan, I don't know if you have anything different, but from what I've seen in my 6 months, a little bit, but not a lot. We've been reached out to, especially around like larger civic and community engagement stuff, voting, days of service, things like that. But they do have a ton of resources that I would love to partner with them more. So thank you for that reminder, because I'm definitely going to use that.
Yeah, and I bring that up because OSU, like the University of Texas at Austin, I mean, we've all sort of reached this being very inaccessible as public institutions, right? And the way that we find our relevance is through actually working with the diverse pipeline of students that you all are engaging. And so I think self-interest, right? I think there's a lot of mutual benefit in those kinds of partnerships as well.
Well, Valeria, go ahead. And then Sarah.
Something I want to say about like the wall, like this year's like digital, and it is pretty cool, and I'm sure it was very expensive. But last year we just had a whiteboard, and I would just write the questions, and we had like markers, like expo markers, and it was great. Like it was amazing. To be honest, I liked it a little bit more just because it got like more colorful than this one, and people got like very creative. But it was really good. So like if you want to do something like that, you could. Or also something we've done in classes is to have like the posters, like big white poster papers, and then like you just put them there with the questions and people write on it when they're like bored or something. Something I wanted to talk about was the second point in what are the obstacles, the one that says students feel unsafe having conversations in any setting. And I can completely relate to that because I've been in classes that I'm just not comfortable speaking about anything, because I'm like, especially here we are in a Catholic institution and I'm not like the most Catholic person ever. So sometimes I'm like, I'd rather just like not say anything, like whatever. But I feel like the main thing that I've seen that has been successful to make students participate and feel like safe is to set some sort of community guidelines at the beginning and have people participate in them, not just like, oh, these are our guidelines. More of like, okay, what do people want? And everyone is like open-mindedness, like respect, what stays here like doesn't live here. And like when you get that, it's like, okay, now like everyone's like on the same like mindset, and then have people like share stuff. Like in our DIT colloquium, like one of the icebreakers was like, bring something from your room and talk about it. Like the most random things, but that just gets people like getting to know each other, and then they're like way more open, at least in my experience, to like share their opinions.
Awesome.
That.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Go ahead.
I'll just really quickly say I put some free resources for guides into the chat. I know that doesn't eliminate a lot of a resource challenge. Like I don't want to say that guides are the end all be all, but a couple of potential free resources. And I think looking for those opportunities of things that can be brought in that don't require a ton of additional work is something that when faculty, when staff, when campuses are stressed, what can be brought in to achieve the things you want to do rather than be an additional add-on. And I know National Issues Forum, Living Room Conversations, the Unify Challenge, these are all opportunities for that.
Oh yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Oh yeah, well, actually +1 to what Valeria said about the creating the norms and the shared commitments to each other. And one of the interesting ones that I've seen more often coming up now is the sentiment like half-baked ideas are okay to share. Like students giving each other permission to sort of share like, hey, I'm still exploring this issue. It's not fully baked. And I think that's really an important one. The other thing I wanted to lift up is that the National Issues Forums guides are really good, Sarah. One thing that I will say that's been really powerful in the practicum class that Jake participated in, last year we had Slippery Rock, Marquette, and Yale participate. This year we have a far more diverse set of post-secondary institutions that are where students are coming from. And I love the fact that that is also an opportunity for that cross-pollination of different geographic regions, different sort of types of institutions for students that are in those settings to connect with each other. And one of the things that they're doing is they're actually developing the guides themselves. And I think that's a powerful learning tool for them, because a lot of times you have to encourage students to think about, well, you're getting all of your sources from one particular place. How can you diversify the perspectives that you're including in that resource? And that's a powerful learning opportunity in and of itself.
Great suggestion, Tom. And I also noticed the curriculum group they've like came out ahead. They had a whole bunch of ideas and resources. So thank you for doing that on your Jamboard.
Yeah, I don't like losing. You
Thank you, Tom.
gamified it and I took the bait.
It works. And I mean, so those are there to kind of take a look at. The one that it's just because it relates to some of the conversation we just had about making community agreements. Students feel unsafe having conversations in any setting, which is very provocative, and just wondering, kind of that seems at the core of what we're trying to do, is how do we create that kind of space where students feel safe and can share across and bridge differences and make decisions. So where did that idea come, like that kind of challenge come from?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I was just wondering, in the student life group, someone put up the challenge of students feel unsafe in ending settings, or maybe anyone else could talk about that. Like, kind of how do you overcome, or how is that a challenge of, students feeling worried about being canceled, worried about kind of their mental health struggles, worried about what their peers are thinking. I think it's often now I'm hearing more peer-to-peer challenge than even kind of worried about it affecting their grades, about kind of feeling comfortable kind of sharing a controversial idea. Or
I can share. Sorry, I'm on two devices and I'm having like audio issues. I was in the student life group. I think I was the one that wrote that, but I think it was Virginia's comment. But I think what we were talking about in terms of feeling unsafe in spaces is a couple different things. One is the power dynamic. So oftentimes I work in civic engagement at a community college, and I will host events both for students and faculty and staff in the same space. And so sometimes that creates a power dynamic where students may not feel comfortable speaking up because if there's a professor in the room, and as you said, if they're worried about grading or things like that, there's also power dynamics between faculty and staff in the space. So if a supervisor is in the room, what can I say? What am I legally allowed to say? That sort of thing. And so that creates a lot of that, those safety concerns, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, and thanks for adding Virginia's comment and like that collaborative kind of co-creative process. So Sara, maybe we'll have you say a final word, because we're just at 2:30 and want to honor people's time, but I want to kind of have you have a kind of a closing comment, and then we'll do a kind of final thank you.
I think my comment hopefully does allow us to close this session, but open the pathways. And that's really what I think is important to remember, that when students or faculty or staff or community members feel like it is difficult to have conversations across divide, think about what is the small pathway that can be opened. We don't have to do everything in a day. We are taking first steps on a longer journey. And I think that is an important perspective for this work too. And I'll shout out the book that Nick had shared at the beginning of the chat. I think there's a lot of really good short form activities that can be those pathways. We've mentioned others today as well. So think about what are the pathways that you can create for students and your community members to start walking down initial opportunities for more productive civil discourse.
Awesome. Sorry, you really made the metaphor work with the walking at the end too as well. So that's a perfect way to close this session, but also open up pathways. We hope you all got some good resources and got to connect with each other. All of our emails are in that Google Doc. So we would love to follow up with you, be in conversation with you, and have this be a part of starting really thinking about how this could be built across our campuses. And I know Campus Compact, this is kind of the start of a whole bunch of different sessions on deliberative dialogue. We'd love you to be part of those. And also if you have ideas about like specific tools, resources that you'd love to see Campus Compact developing, or developing in collaboration with other folks, we'd love to welcome those ideas as well. And Clayton, any final kind of Campus Compact words or ways to stay connected with you? I know you have some other series going on as well.
No, thank you. I want to respect people's time, but yes, we will have more discussions on dialogue and deliberation. We have a web page on, if you go to current programs on our web page, you'll see some of the upcoming stuff that Nick is doing, and we'll add more to that as we get later into this fall semester quarter. So thank you all for being here today. Let's stay connected. I will follow up with all these resources to you all. I'll also send a video to you and others who originally registered that you can share with colleagues if they're interested, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks.